Oh.
But just like any other private sector organisation, they've got to look at how they get a grip on their pension costs.
It's the biggest pension fund in the country and it has the biggest black hole. Almost £8 billion of a shortfall. It's the scheme for university teachers. And balancing the books could result in even higher tuition fees. We'll try to find out who'll end up paying the bill. The death boats that lead some of the wretched of the earth to perish on the sea in sight of Europe. We tell one family's story.
We called, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. They fired at the hull of the boat and left. Water began leaking into the boat.
And a blow for freedom or an act of desperation? Newspaper publishers apply for a judicial review of politicians' efforts to set up a new press regulator. The managing editor of The Sun and Max Mosley are here. And
this caravan really was shaping up to be something wonderful. But then...
Jeremy Clarkson might not like the Tesla electric car, but does Elon Musk, the billionaire behind it, care?
Like, his two pet peeves are American cars and electric cars. And we're an American electric car. So we're in the worst possible situation for someone like Clarkson.
And the death of Anthony Caro, who changed the face of British sculpture. Good evening. All kinds of pension funds have been in trouble in recent years, at least in part, because poor stock market performance has seen bad returns on investments. But the problems of the Universities Superannuation Scheme, or USS, dwarfs the rest. The pension scheme for university teaching staff faces a shortfall officially put at £7.9 billion. But analysis for Newsnight reveals that using the methods private companies use, it'd be far higher, £10.5 billion. To fix that would require a rise in tuition fees of up to £1,000 a year. Andy Verity reports.
Drinks and canapes to celebrate exactly 50 years since the government accepted the recommendations of this man, Lionel Robbins. Before his 1963 report, only 5% of people went to university. After it, university places trebled. With that went a big expansion in teaching staff and also in the cost of the pensions they were promised. The Universities Superannuation Scheme is now the biggest pension fund in the country, with a gaping deficit. Here's what the University Pension Scheme told its 303,000 members this month about the size of its black hole. It has assets, money to pay pensions, of £37.9 billion. But its liabilities, the pensions it's promised to pay out, are much higher, £45.8 billion. That's a shortfall of £7.9 billion. Put another way, it has just 83% of the money it needs. Critics of the USS, as the university scheme is known, say its managers aren't doing anything like what they must do to close that black hole.
There's a whole degree of denial. USS is in denial about its real financial position. Universities are in denial about the cost of pension promises. We've seen private sector pension schemes closing to new members and closing to existing members wholesale over the last few years. USS can't stand up and say, we've got a real problem, we've been making too small contributions over the last few years, we've been running a very risky investment strategy, this is where it's got us and this is what we need to do. And there will be repercussions for the university sector. If we don't have those repercussions now and over the next few years, all we're doing is bequeathing a very big problem to our children.
The thing about pensions is they span decades. You're a member of that scheme from the day you start chipping in until the day you die. And that means that actuaries have to make assumptions about the pension scheme, how fast investments will grow and how much they'll have to pay out. At the stroke of an actuary's pen, you can gain or lose billions. What the actuaries know is the pensions they've promised to pay staff in the future. They also know how much money they currently have to pay those pensions. What they have to take a guess on is how much that money will be worth by the time it's needed. So they wave their pen and assume a growth rate. That will either be enough to cover their promises, or if it's not, you have your black hole. You can see the temptation. assume a higher growth rate and your black hole shrinks. Actuaries for most private firms have to follow a strict formula for working out their deficits called FRS 17, where you have to assume growth based on market interest rates.
It just seems to me completely wrong that whereas private sector companies, and indeed even public sector schemes, have to come up with their figures on an FRS 17 basis, that USS doesn't do that. They choose a figure, and that figure is pretty well plucked out of the air. It's the actuary's magic pencil.
Mr. Ralph calculates the true deficit at 10.5 billion. To fix that over 20 years, employers would have to throw far more money at the scheme.
At the moment, there's about £1 billion going in from the universities. That figure needs to go up to about £1.8 billion, almost doubling. The fees are probably going to have to go up from the 9,000 is the maximum by about £1,000. So it's £1,000 that each individual undergraduate has to pay, not just next year, but for the next 20 years.
If the cost of pensions is going to force up tuition fees by around about £1,000 a year, there's one man who should know about it, the Minister for Higher Education, David Willetts. Now, it just so happens he's turned up at this conference. Why didn't I go and ask him? Our analysis shows that if you use the same basis companies have to use, the deficit on the university's pension scheme is £10 billion. How do you react to that?
I don't recognise that particular figure, but look, universities are independent autonomous bodies, and they know that one of their financial responsibilities is to stand behind their pensions and to sort out their deficits.
Our numbers also suggest that this is going to push up tuition fees by up to £1,000. Would you acknowledge that these pressures on pensions could make tuition fees more expensive?
It would be wrong to expect students to bail out pension deficits to support pension schemes that are far more generous than those which students are likely to enjoy when they're in work.
But if fixing the deficit requires much higher contributions, how would the universities recover that money?
It's very worrying now, and it looks even more worrying for the future. It would be an added cost, which we would have to cover either from tuition fees or from some other source, private philanthropy, earnings from consulting or other enterprises.
The man just appointed by the USS to run its scheme was, 2 months ago, the man who ran the pensions regulator. Is he comfortable with the size of this deficit? Let's be blunt. You're going to have to ask the employers sponsoring your scheme to put their money put their hands in their pockets, aren't you?
But this is the normal course of deciding how to fund a pension scheme that's here for the long term. You know, we have to look out 80 years.
Was that a yes?
I said it's a normal process. Look, it's been done in 2008. It was done in 2011. We're looking at it again now.
The members of the scheme won't like to hear that. University staff are already planning to strike next week over pay.
If they are going to ask us to pay more, one, we will want to know that the long-term future of the fund is clearly one that's at risk. Two, we will want to make sure that the employers themselves are making an equal and increased contribution as well.
The USS has 3/4 of its money in relatively risky investments, shares, property and alternative investments like a stake in Heathrow, unlike other funds who buy more safe government bonds. The hope is that those investments will rise in value and close up that black hole. But that's been the strategy for years now. So far, at least, it hasn't worked.
Andy Verity reporting there. Well, earlier I spoke to Professor Anton Muscatelli, who's chair of the Employers Pension Forum, and Bernard Casey, a pensions expert from Warwick University's Institute for Employment Research and a USS pension scheme member. I started by asking Professor Muscatelli, how exactly did the universities end up running the biggest pension fund deficit in the country?
Well, it's not as simple as that, because a pension fund deficit can't just be measured at one point in time. It is hugely volatile. One of the things that's happened over the last couple of years, of course, is that bond yields have fallen because of quantitative easing. And in fact, it's not the assets of the pension fund that have changed dramatically over the last 2 years, but you have almost a day-to-day volatility in the liabilities.
But that's true of everybody's pension fund. But this is the worst in Britain, and it's getting worse for years on year. And those figures of 7.9 billion at one point in time, I mean, we have consulted people who say if you measured it the same way that private industry did, it would be 10.5 billion.
Well, the point is you cannot measure it at a point in time because it can change from month to month and it can go down as well as up.
But it's huge. It's huge.
It's large. And indeed, what we're doing as part of our work as employers is to work with the USS to work with the unions in partnership to produce sustainable pensions.
Are you cheered up by that, Bernard?
No, I'm actually not. I mean, I find it rather ridiculous to try and blame QE. OK, it is true that QE has an impact upon bond yields, but QE also has an impact upon bond prices. So any bonds that one has in one's portfolio increase in value.
What do you think the problem is then?
I think the problem is a poor match of assets to liabilities in general. If you look at USS as a scheme, it is a relatively mature scheme. About half of the members are either retired people or they are deferred pensioners. They're people who are no longer contributing and probably never will again. If you have those kinds of liabilities, you need to match those kinds of liabilities.
Do you see the force of that?
Not entirely. I don't agree with all of it. Of course, you have to match liabilities and your assets. But in fact, what is happening with USS is that it's a scheme that has done well in terms of its asset base. It actually has grown.
But do you understand that anybody watching this will say, if I'm a student or my son or daughter is a student, we're going to end up paying for it because the fees are inevitably going to go up because there's a huge shortfall?
That's not right at all, and that is not the approach that we're taking. Deficits of this type have to be addressed through a recovery plan, which can take 10, 15, perhaps even 20 years. The covenant that the employers have, that the USS employers have, is extremely strong. So we can afford to manage this over a long period of time. It's about constructing the right financial management plan, and more importantly, it's about producing sustainable pensions that are right not only for the employers, but for the employees. And it's about working in partnership with the employees to come up with a good plan.
Do you think it will inevitably fall on the students?
Effectively, income comes to universities on the basis of the number of students they've got, the kinds of courses that they are teaching them, and on the amount of research that they do and the excellence of their research. If you have additional costs coming along, those additional costs, which are over and above any additional costs which are to do with the fact you want to improve the quality of the teaching, you want to improve the quality of your facilities, all those costs have got to come from somewhere. And it is a bit like the universities having to go along to the government and say, I'm terribly sorry, but we have lost rather a lot of money because we went down to the local casino and our money disappeared. Can we have something to match that hole? And the government is like to say, no, you get your money under this formula for those purposes. We don't pay for you to go off and engage in speculative practices.
OK, we'll leave it there. Thank you both very much. Thank you.